Uh, I want to thank you for inviting me to give these comments on my book, Taking the Constitution Away from the Courts. As I was preparing to do it, I realized that the book is now a quarter century old. And my thinking and the field has developed since then, of course. So I'll be offering something like a retrospective view uh, of the work with some comments about how my thinking has developed or changed since I wrote the book. Um, I should note that two aspects of the sort of intellectual history behind the book. One is that it was a relatively early product of my interest in comparative constitutional law. In some ways, the idea behind the book was decisively shaped by my study in the early 1990s of the Canadian system, in which there's a constitutional provision allowing the Parliament to uh, override Supreme Court decisions. Um, I thought that was an interesting mechanism to include in a constitution. And then, second, the book is located within a discourse or dialogue started early in the 1990s by Richard Bellamy and developed a bit more by Jeremy Waldron, in which they counterposed what they called legal constitutionalism, which I think is better called judicial constitutionalism, to political constitutionalism. And my work is in the political constitutionalist vein. The distinction between the two, of course, is now familiar. Judicial constitutionalism says that ultimately the final word on constitutional interpretation comes from the courts. Uh, Legislatures, executive officials can offer their own judgments about the Constitution, but when a constitutional court rules on what the Constitution means, that defines the Constitution's meaning for all actors in the system, not merely judges, but for legislators and executives going forward. Um, Political constitutionalism, in contrast, says that the ultimate word is held in the hands of the legislatures and executive political actors. Uh, and the courts can weigh in, offer their own interpretations of the Constitution, but through a variety of institutional mechanisms, political constitutionalism says that the last word, the ultimate word, comes through the political institutions. So the override mechanism is one way in which you can integrate some role for the courts, but ultimately leave interpretation to the political branches. Now, there are a couple of aspects of political constitutionalism that need to be emphasized. First, as Waldron emphasized in particular, the effectiveness of political constitutionalism or its ability to advance deep constitutional values rests to some degree on some significant commitment among a substantial number of the population to constitutional values, not merely to getting out of the government the things that benefit them in the short run. Uh, Now, exactly how much, how substantial the commitment has to be, how large the population committed to constitutional values has to be, is going to vary from nation to nation. But it's important to emphasize that in order to defend political constitutionalism, you don't have to believe that every citizen all the time is primarily focused on advancing constitutional values rather than getting out of the government policies that benefit them personally. All you need is some, I don't know, we don't really know how much commitment in some significant segment of the population, sufficient to give politicians incentives to worry about the Constitution. If they disregard the Constitution, they have to think. Then this segment of the population will mobilize against them, and that will be a political disadvantage. The second feature that of political constitutionalism that I want to emphasize is that it's a question about, or it's a commitment to um, uh, decision by political actors, constitutional interpretation by political actors, that is effective in the short to medium run. Um, every constitutional system is designed in ways that give political actors control of constitutional meaning in the long run, either by amending the Constitution or, in a judicial constitutionalist vein, uh, uh, setting up mechanisms for the appointment of constitutional court judges that bring them into line with the political system over the long run period. So political constitutionalism and judicial constitutionalism are stand in contrast uh, in terms of their temporal focus. Okay, so I think that's a sort of background of the book, my summary of the book. Now, a couple of developments. One foreshadowed at the very end of the book and become clearer over time. Um, the book defends political constitutionalism, but not for all constitutional nations at all times. There will be political circumstances, I would say mostly short run, in which judicial constitutionalism is clearly to be preferred over political constitutionalism. So, for example, take the Canadian override mechanism. Um, it seems clearly to have worked in some significant way in Canada and in Great Britain, where there's a similar system in place. Um, when Israeli politicians, mostly conservative, sought to introduce an override mechanism, and actually did introduce an override mechanism into Israeli law, there is a quite substantial political backlash. And from a constitutionalist point of view, probably justified. Um, uh, Under the political circumstances of Israel at the time this mechanism was sought to be introduced, doing so would have led to a significant shortfall in the defense of constitutional values. Um, so the choice between judicial and political constitutionalism, sort of on the normative level, is going to depend on your evaluation of the contemporary circumstances facing particular nations. If I understand things right, there's some discussion going on in Brazil about introducing an override mechanism. Um, I have no views on that because I don't know the political circumstances of Brazil well enough to know whether in the circumstances you're facing, the override mechanism would advance constitutional values or undermine them. I just don't know. As you in Brazil discuss such a mechanism, if in fact such a discussion is occurring, you're going to have to focus on the political circumstances that you face. Uh, the second development that I want to emphasize, and I will finish with this, is a very recent one in an extremely important book by Eileen Kavanagh of Trinity College, Dublin. She argues for what she calls a collaborative constitution. And she counterposes that to both political constitutionalism and judicial constitutionalism. She says that the discussion about political and judicial constitutionalism has been misfocused. It pays attention to the moments of crisis and conflict and seeks to determine who should prevail in moments of crisis and conflict. But Kavanaugh says most of the time, in most reasonably well-functioning constitutional systems, and that's a very large category, including countries that whose governance systems aren't all that great, but even in those countries, most of the time, the political actors and the judicial actors collaborate on working out through informal interactions, not what has been theorized as a dialogue, but just through the sort of daily exchange of doing work. They work out what the Constitution means. Now, I think that's a very valuable insight. We as Constitution scholars, at least I really do, tend to focus on moments of crisis. But constitutional systems chug along all the time, facing constitutional problems that get resolved in a relatively uncontentious way. Sometimes the things that the courts say first win out. Sometimes the courts take the first move, but there's some modification by the political branches, and the courts say, sure, that's fine. Sometimes the political branches say, well, look, this is the way we think it's sensible to deal with this constitutional issue. And the courts say, well, mostly you've got it right, but here's a little thing that you ought to tinker with. And I do think that adding the perspective of the collaborative constitution to the discussions of judicial and political constitutionalism really will, over the next decade or so, be a central feature of the study of constitutional design. Okay, so you asked for a relatively short introduction. I probably spent a little more time than you expected, but I'm pleased to be able to offer this to you for whatever it's worth. And again, I thank you for your attention.